In the last video of this series, we went over several pieces of evidence which infer the resurrection of Jesus. However, there is so much evidence we couldn't possibly fit it into one video. So I want to go over an additional, yet important piece of data that is often missed when evaluating the resurrection theory, and it is the origins of the Christian resurrection belief in comparison to the Jewish messianic expectations of resurrection and the Messiah from that time. N.T. Wright wrote a 740-page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, asking the simple question, where did the resurrection beliefs of the Christians come from? The Christian belief of God and the Messiah was unlike anything from the ancient world. So the question arises, where could such a belief come from if this was all made up? The Christians believe, unlike their Jewish counterparts, that the Messiah was Jesus, who died and was physically resurrected. This was unlike anything Second Temple Jews were looking for, and expected the Messiah to be a conqueror who would break the rule of Rome and restore the kingdom of Israel. No one was looking for or thought God in the flesh would come as the Messiah to die and be physically resurrected in order to save us from our sins. Because of this, a lot of laymen try to claim this belief was borrowed from paganism. However, it is not supported by any New Testament scholarship, for the simple reason that pagans didn't believe it was possible to come back from death. From Homer to Plato, all ancient pagans knew one thing: death was a one-way street. Aeschylus said, "Once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection." Callimachus wrote a dialogue of someone asking a soul in Hades if there was a way out. "O Charideus, what of the world below? Much darkness. And what of an upward way? A lie." In the Iliad and Odyssey, the theme is pretty obvious. Once you are dead, you stay dead. When Priam mourns the death of her son Hector, Achilles tells her, "Lamenting for your son will do you no good at all. You will be dead yourself before you bring him back to life." Later in the Odyssey, Odysseus journeys to the underworld and engages with dead spirits, but even though they want to, none of them have any hope of returning from the underworld. As soon as a spirit leaves the white bones, and the ghost, like a dream, flutters off and is gone. The world of ancient pagans was pretty depressing. There was no return from death, just a hopeless existence as a wandering spirit in the underworld. Later on, there is a bit of hope in the works of Pindar, Plato, and Cicero, who argued although the body would die, the soul was immortal and would leave this world for a better spiritual existence. There was in fact a heaven the pagans could hope for, but it was not a bodily resurrection. In fact, a bodily resurrection was something that would have disappointed them, who hoped for liberation from the physical and to be transformed into a spiritual existence. As N.T. Wright says, neither in Plato nor in the major alternatives just mentioned do we find any suggestion that resurrection, the return to bodily life of the dead person, was either desirable or possible. One of the few tales of a return to bodily life in the ancient pagan world can be seen when Hercules rescues Alcestis from the underworld. But this can hardly be interpreted as what the Christians believed in, which was an eternal physical existence. Alcestis could only be classified as a resuscitation, which is brought back to immortal existence, and it is expected they will die again. Whereas resurrection was more understood as coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body, and never dying again. And it was expected that Alcestis was only resuscitated and would die like everyone else and be trapped in the underworld eventually. Celsus and other pagan critics also dismissed these stories as impossible and mere fiction. Pagans did not take such stories seriously, nor make them their core doctrine. Resurrection and resuscitation were things to poke fun at, but not something they hoped for or thought was possible. And N.T. Wright addresses dozens of other pagan stories and authors in his book. Basically, you either followed Plato and didn't want a bodily resurrection, or you were a follower of the old ways in Homer and knew you would not get a body again. Even in Egypt, this was not something that was conceived to be possible. In Egypt, there was no eschatology, no apocalypse, no collective cataclysm, because there was no crisis. Death was life. In Egypt, death was just a continuation of life, not the end and the need for the hope of a bodily return. Death was just the next step of bodily life in the next world, but there was no return to this world. So like the rest of the pagan world, death was the end of the existence in this life, which is unlike what the Christians believed about their own future and what they had thought had already happened to Jesus. However, many laymen across the internet want to tell us Jesus was just copied off of pagan deities who were also physically resurrected. But this cannot be further from the truth, and this is why scholars do not take these theories as credible. Many of these pagan deities were not human who were physically resurrected, but were metaphorically resurrected along with the crop cycles or with the setting and the rising of the sun, like with Horus. Horus died every night, so to speak, and was resurrected in a sense when it rose. As N.T. Wright says, Did any worshippers in these cults from Egypt to Norway at any time in antiquity think that actual human beings, having died, actually come back to life? Of course not. These multifarious and sophisticated cults enacted the god's death and resurrection as a metaphor, whose concrete referent was the cycle of seed time and harvest, of human reproduction and fertility. Stanley Porter says, bodily resurrection is not part of such cults and their beliefs. This pagan idea of God's dying and rising did not fit with the idea of how resurrection was actually defined in Christianity, that is, of a physical human body dying and coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body. This was in contrast to Second Temple Jews. While there was a variety of Jewish beliefs about the afterlife, ranging from those like Philo, who agreed with Plato that heaven would be in disembodied existence, to the Sadducees, who thought there was no afterlife at all, but that when we died, we simply rotted in the grave, and that was the end of our existence. But the majority of the Jews held to the Pharisaic idea that at the end of time, God would resurrect his saints into an eternal physical existence. Heaven would not be a disembodied existence, but a new heaven and a new earth with new glorified bodies. For the Christians, their belief that Jesus was resurrected was strictly Jewish in origin. It was the Jews who believed that at the end of time, God would resurrect all his children into an eternal bodily existence. However, Wright notes, the Christian belief mutated in several ways, and it is difficult to explain how this happened. First, the Christians made resurrection their central theme. There are many long Jewish works from around that era, which never mention resurrection. But for the Christians, this was their central theme that defined them. The early Christian movement fully centered around the idea that Jesus was resurrected, and their future hope rested in what he had done. As Paul said very early on, if there is no resurrection, your hope is in vain. There is no reason an early Jewish sect would feel the need to do this. Adding to that, the early Jews talked a little about resurrection, but they did not know what it would be like. Would it be shining like a star, as Daniel put it, or would it be a body exactly like the one we have now? But the early Christians moved from this debate to claiming they knew exactly what the resurrected body would be like, based on what they believed had happened to Jesus, and not what they had read from the Old Testament. For them, the resurrected body would be something transformed from the old material into a new incorruptible body with new properties. N.T. Wright notes that Christians like Paul or Matthew would constantly pull from the Old Testament to show Jesus was a fulfillment of the law. The Christians were constantly appealing to the Old Testament to support their case. But strangely enough, when they describe the resurrected body, there is a lack of appeals to the Old Testament description of the resurrected body. If the Christians were ransacking the Old Testament to try to make up a story of a resurrected Messiah, you would expect them to do that with the resurrected body as well, and paint the body of Jesus shining like a star, just like Daniel puts it. But instead, they described a body unlike what people were expecting, and provide no Old Testament support for it. The next mutation is the resurrection of the dead has become a two-stage process. They agree with Pharisaic Judaism that the resurrection would happen to all God's people at the end of time, but they also said it happened to Jesus in advance. There is no reason any Jewish sect would make this claim. The only people to ever suggest a theory like this were in fact the Christians. Jewish saints who had previously died, like the Maccabean martyrs or early prophets, were said to have been vindicated by God and would be resurrected with all God's people at the end of time. But no one ever dared to claim this had already happened to them. If resurrection was just a way to describe how a martyr was vindicated by God, we would expect to see this of all saints who had died, like Moses up through John the Baptist. But we don't see any Jews applying this language. Nor do we see the Christians describing this to have happened to these other saints as well. Only the Christians said this only happened to one man who had died, Jesus of Nazareth. To claim such a thing would not only be incompatible with pagan beliefs, but also with Jewish expectations. To claim to Pharisaic Jews that one person had been resurrected in the middle of time would have been odd as saying that the Roman emperor was the Messiah. No one would have expected such an event to happen, and no one expected this to be about the Messiah. Which brings us to the most important mutation the Christians made. The Christians claimed that Jesus was the Messiah specifically because of his resurrection. No Jews had expected this because no one had expected the Messiah would die, let alone a shameful, humiliating death by the Roman enemy. Yes, there are Old Testament texts that Christians appealed to support their case that the Messiah would die for the sins of mankind, but it is very clear no one had read them in that way until the Christians came onto the scene. The Jews expected the Messiah to be a conqueror who would free God's people from the yoke of Rome and establish an everlasting kingdom of Israel. The Messiah was to be like King David, not a poor man from Nazareth of all places, who was just a spiritual teacher and who the Jewish authorities turned over to the Romans to be shamefully mocked and executed like a criminal, all to die for our sins. The Second Temple Jews didn't believe or expect this to be necessary. Such a portrait of Jesus, for any Jew, should have dispelled any hope that he was the Messiah instantly, as so had happened with other supposed messiahs from around that time. What I mean to say is, we have evidence for several messianic movements from before and after the time of Jesus, and they all mostly end with the death of the alleged Messiah. And no one at that point thought their death meant they were indeed the Messiah. Quite the opposite. The death proved these men were definitely not the Messiah, and the movements that surrounded them disbanded once they had died. If your Messiah was killed, you either went back to normal life, or you got yourself a new Messiah, as so was the case with every Messianic Jewish movement, except for the Christians. Had the Christians wanted a new Messiah, they had a likely candidate, James, the brother of Jesus. But even according to Josephus, no one ever called James the Messiah, but only the brother of the Lord. All the other Messianic movements from around that time are nothing like what we see in early Christianity. Yet modern skeptics wish to tell us that Christianity simply came out of this Jewish world through a little imagination. But N.T. Wright silences this with a little critical analysis, using what we know Jews of that time expected and thought about the Messiah.
Now this means that we can already rule out some very common suggestions. Many have proposed that the early disciples were so overwhelmed with grief at Jesus' death that they picked up the idea of resurrection from their surrounding culture and clung on to that. Maybe he's been raised from the dead, maybe, and then finally persuading themselves it was true, and then going out and telling people that it was true. Some have suggested that the earliest Christians believed that after his death Jesus had been exalted to heaven, and then they gradually started to speak about resurrection because of that. Or that they had a sense that they had to carry on his mission to bring in God's kingdom, and that made them say he was raised from the dead. But would that make any sense? We can test it out with a little thought experiment. In AD 70, 40 years after Jesus' death, the Romans conquered Jerusalem and they led thousands of Jews captive back to Rome. Back, including the man they regarded as the king of the Jews, the leader of the Jewish revolt, a man called Simon Bar Giora. Simon was led into Rome at the back of Titus's triumphal procession. And at the end of the spectacle, as everyone knew was going to happen, the king, the rebel king, the leader of the enemy, was flogged and executed. Now, supposing we imagine a few Jewish revolutionaries 3 days or 3 weeks afterwards. Somehow they've managed to escape being killed themselves and they're in hiding. And one says, I think Simon really was the Messiah, and I think he still is. And the others are puzzled. Of course he isn't. The Romans got him. They killed him. That's what they do to people. If you want a Messiah, you better find another one. Says the first, but I think he's been raised from the dead. What do you mean, his friends ask? He's dead and buried. Oh no, replies the first. I believe he's been exalted to heaven. The others look very puzzled. All the righteous martyrs, all those who have died for their faith, of course they're in heaven with God. Everybody knows that. The souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and there shall no torment touch them. Famous Jewish text. That doesn't mean they've already been raised from the dead. It means they will be one day. Resurrection isn't something that happens to one person in the middle of history. No, replies the first, you don't understand. I've had a strong sense of God's love surrounding me. I've found God forgiving me for running away. I've felt my heart strangely warmed. What's more, last night I really thought that Simon was there with me. And the others interrupt and they're now angry. We can all have visions. Plenty of people dream about recently dead friends or family members. Sometimes that's very vivid. That doesn't mean they've been raised from the dead. It certainly doesn't mean that one of them is the Messiah. And if your heart has been warmed, then for goodness sake, sing a psalm. Don't make wild claims about a dead man. That is what they would have said to anyone offering the kind of statement which, according to the revisionists, the skeptics, somebody must have come up with at the beginning, as the beginning of the idea of Jesus' resurrection. But this solution isn't just incredible, it's historically impossible. Had anyone said any of those things that revisionists have suggested, some such conversation as I've just given you would have ensued. A little bit of disciplined historical imagination is all it takes to blow away enormous piles of so-called historical criticism.
Christianity is still an anomaly of history. Based on what we know about Jewish messianic expectations and movements from that era, it should have been easily predicted that upon the death of Jesus, his followers should have disbanded or found a new Messiah. But the exact opposite happened, which doesn't make any sense with Second Temple Judaism. From knowing everything we do about that time period, we would never have predicted such a movement should have formed. Something completely out of the ordinary would need to have happened, which transformed ordinary Jews from believing a Pharisaic view about the Messiah into a completely new, unexpected Christian view. What happened which caused such a historical anomaly? Looking at the theories we went over in the previous video, which attempt to explain this data, we have to realize the mythic theory has no hope of explaining this. We know the physical resurrection belief about the Messiah was not something Christians made up long after the disciples had passed away, because of the creed Paul preserves for us in 1 Corinthians 15, which is dated to within 3 years of Pentecost. This belief about Jesus was there from the start, as even Josephus records, and even if someone later on wanted to make up a story about a Jewish sage, reporting that he was physically resurrected was so misplaced from Jewish expectations and what the surrounding pagan world had hoped for. It would have made more sense for the pagans to paint Jesus like a second Socrates, a martyr of wisdom who had ascended to the spiritual realm, and by following his teachings, you can make it there too. Not that he was physically resurrected in space and time, and only through accepting him as Lord and true Emperor and King, you could be saved. A similar story would have happened if someone wished to convince the Jews. Just paint Jesus like another Old Testament prophet who was persecuted for his faith to God. But to declare him Messiah and that his kingdom on earth had already begun made no sense for the Jews who were still under Roman rule. Because of this, we also have to rule out the conspiracy theory for the same reasons. And also, if the Christians were simply making up a story to fool people into believing Jesus had resurrected, we would expect them to ransack the scriptures and report Jesus was shining like a star, just like Daniel says, instead of making up something no one was expecting. It would have been harder than today than if we declared Martin Luther King Jr. was a resurrected Messiah. Surely he was a great teacher and leader who was killed, but that doesn't mean he was raised from the dead, let alone a prophesied Messiah. The only way anyone would be convinced of this is if he appeared to them alive. And even if, against all odds, one managed to come up with this utterly misplaced idea and convince all the other remaining followers of Jesus, they would still have to justify the other facts we already went over, meaning they would have to steal the body, possibly induce group hallucinations to cover the other appearances, then take the light of their grave through persecution and torture. With the hallucination theory, as N.T. Wright went over, if someone thought they had a vision Jesus was vindicated by God and was in heaven, that would not mean he was physically raised, let alone the expected Messiah. It would have simply been dispelled as a vision, or the disciples would have taught Jesus was spiritually vindicated. But to be bodily raised was something so far out of Jewish expectations, no one would have ever hallucinated that someone could dream up such a story, let alone hallucinate that the event actually happened. As we went over in the previous video, for hallucinations to occur, there needs to be an expectation beforehand. If no one is expecting something, or doesn't have the idea already in their mind, no one is going to hallucinate it. So the hallucination theory is very improbable, given the background knowledge we know of the Jewish culture. No one wanted this to happen, simply because no one thought it was even possible. The only thing that could cause this radical new belief is something would have had to have happened, which could give the disciples a new perspective. New information would need to be introduced, which could cause this new idea that radically transformed the world. And I don't see any other theory which can account for this besides the resurrection theory. From knowing everything we know about Second Temple Judaism, we would never have predicted such a belief would form unless that event actually happened. Combining this with our other pieces of evidence, we can see how other theories which attempt to explain what happened become very improbable in fitting the culture and data. The best theory that can fit all the data is still the one that was reported. The Christians preached Jesus was resurrected because that is what happened, and only that happening could convince them to believe it. One thing we have not done but need to point out is how skeptical scholars address the resurrection. In arguing for the resurrection, we have addressed three very general theories, which are often used by laymen. But to be fair, scholars do not usually use these theories, but usually try a blend of them, instead of just arguing one idea can explain the evidence. These are a little more sophisticated, so to be as fair as we possibly can, we'll take a look at two theories from scholars that have gained some traction. First, in his debate with William Lane Craig, Bart Ehrman put forward a theory he thinks is more probable of what happened after the death of Jesus. This is not his biggest objection to the resurrection, but this theory he put forward has made its rounds, so we should at least hear what he has to say and compare it with the evidence.
The one thing we know about the Christians after the death of Jesus is that they turned to their scriptures to try and make sense of it. They had believed Jesus was the Messiah, but then he got crucified, and so he couldn't be the Messiah. No Christian, no Jew prior to Christianity thought that the Messiah was to be crucified. No Jew prior to Christianity thought that the Messiah was to be crucified. The Messiah was to be a great warrior or a great king, or a great judge. He's to be a figure of grandeur and power, not somebody who's squashed by the enemy like a mosquito. How could Jesus, the Messiah, have been killed as a common criminal? Christians turned to their scriptures to try and understand it, and they found passages that refer to the righteous one of God suffering death. But in these passages, such as Isaiah 53, and Psalm 22, and Psalm 69, the one who is punished or who is killed is also vindicated by God. Christians came to believe their scriptures that Jesus was the righteous one and that God must have vindicated him. And so Christians came to think of Jesus as one who, even though he had been crucified, came to be exalted to heaven, much as Elijah and Enoch have in the Hebrew scriptures. How then is Jesus the Messiah, though, if he's been exalted to heaven? Well, Jesus must be coming back soon to establish the kingdom. He wasn't an earthly Messiah, he's a spiritual Messiah. That's why the early Christians thought the end was coming right away in their own lifetime. That's why Paul taught that Christ was the first fruit of the resurrection. But if Jesus is exalted, he's no longer dead. And so Christians started circulating the story of his resurrection. It wasn't 3 days later they started circulating that story. It might have been a year later, maybe 2 years. 5 years later, they didn't know when the stories had started. Nobody could go to the tomb to check. The body had decomposed. Believers who knew that he'd been raised from the dead started having visions of him. Others told stories about these visions of him, including Paul. Stories of these visions circulated. Some of them were actual visions like Paul. Others of them were stories of visions like the 500 who repeatedly saw him. On the basis of these stories, narratives were constructed and circulated, and eventually we got the Gospels of the New Testament written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later.
So basically he says the disciples believed so strongly that Jesus was the Messiah that upon his death they could not let go of it. So because of this belief in him, they still preached he was the Messiah, but was vindicated by God into heaven. And then they somehow started saying this also meant he was resurrected and was coming back soon to establish the Jewish Messianic kingdom. He also explains away the empty tomb by saying Jesus' body had decomposed by the time the Christians started proclaiming the resurrection. So no one could check to see if the body was still there. Then people started having visions of Christ. Some were made up, but some, like the one Saul of Tarsus had, was real, and these visions constructed the narratives we have today. So the next question to ask is, how does this theory compare to the evidence we have? Is it a better explanation of the evidence than the resurrection theory? Well, Ehrman's theory rests on the foundation that the origins of the resurrection belief stem from a simpler belief that Jesus was exalted to heaven, which also somehow meant he was resurrected. But as we've already shown, this doesn't add up. The Jews never expected or thought the saints who were exalted to heaven were somehow also resurrected and alive again. Resurrection was an event that would happen at the end of time to everyone at once. No one ever described a dead relative or a saint as having already been resurrected. Nor did the Christians use this language to talk of other dead saints, like John the Baptist or Elijah. Only they said this only happened to Jesus. On top of that, nor do the Christians describe the resurrection of Jesus like the general resurrection that is described in Daniel. Jesus is not shining like a star, as Daniel puts it, but it's described in a completely new way. So Ehrman's argument that the disciples stole this idea from their surrounding culture in the Old Testament is untenable and cannot explain the origins of the resurrection belief. It simply could not have come from their culture, as he postulates. On a side note, it can be debated if the Christians thought Jesus would come back in their lifetime, or if they were actually using Jewish apocalyptic language to describe a coming judgment on Jerusalem, which took place in 70 AD. As well as if in speaking of Jesus' return, he was going to come back to fulfill Jewish messianic expectations and establish the earthly ruling throne of David over Rome. The Christians clearly changed their beliefs into thinking Jesus was meant to establish a spiritual kingdom of love and mercy, in which Christ would work through the church to redeem creation. But neither of these are pieces of our evidence, so we'll move on. Ehrman tries to say the corpse of Jesus simply rotted away so no one could go and check. But this is untenable, since the bones of Jesus would have remained, and people knew of the location of the tomb that was used. They would have known if a body was still there. Ehrman even admits during this debate that the women followers of Jesus watched from afar, so they knew where the body was and would have known if the tomb was empty or not. We also need to remember the tomb was in the Sanhedrin section of town, so the remains would have been in their presence, so they could have pulled them out at any time and provided witnesses to counteract the witnesses the tomb was empty. But we never see this as something the Christians needed to respond to. All the evidence indicates the tomb was found empty. This is also backed up even more by the fact that the evidence shows the tomb was found empty just 3 days later by women followers. The majority of scholars accept this because it meets the criteria of embarrassment, being that it was first discovered by women. No early Jew would make this up in such a male-centered culture. Because of this, most scholars accept this piece of data as authentic, and the tomb was found empty just 3 days later. Ehrman has, in other debates, said he thinks this could be just a mythic invention, and not rule out that it could have been invented. But this is ad hoc and hardly a response. As we have already discussed, the mythic theory cannot explain this. So Ehrman cannot explain the empty tomb as a later invention or decomposition. He also tries to say there was no early evidence the disciples suffered and died for their belief. But we did go over plenty of early and secular evidence. Paul mentions persecutions, Josephus says James was martyred, and Clement notes Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome. So we do have evidence at least some of the early witnesses suffered and died for their belief in the resurrection. He doesn't ever address how the gospel was proclaimed very early on in Jerusalem, where you would not go if the evidence was not in your favor. Tim McGrew tries to bring this up in his debate with him, but he doesn't seem to understand the issue, so we don't know how he would try to address this one. This brings us to the appearances themselves. As for Paul, who was a skeptic, he accepts Paul had to experience something which would cause his conversion, but he just says Paul had a vision which converted him. But as we have already demonstrated, this is untenable, since Paul would have been the least likely to convert or experience a hallucination of Jesus, so this is ad hoc. With the other appearances, he says some of them were made up, but some were real, so he tries to mix a hallucination and conspiracy theory. I don't know why he thinks the appearance to 500 can simply be dismissed as false. He agrees the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which mentions this, is very early. He only seems to imply it could not happen because 500 people could not experience Jesus at once, which is arguing from a presupposition. If the only reason as to why it could not happen is because Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it simply is arguing in a circle, and that doesn't actually refute the evidence. Sure, it is possible it was just an invention, but it would have been very hard for the Christians to make this up very early on without actually having the witnesses to back this up, unless they somehow managed to keep 500 people in on it. And again, if some people had visions in this Jewish culture where resurrection was not supposed to happen yet, these visions would only have implied a spiritual vindication to heaven, not a physical return to life. Plus, as we already went over, the appearances do not match typical signs of hallucinations. But we'll allow this one to tentatively pass, since it still is possible they were made up, if this is the only fact we have to go on. But it hardly satisfies the other pieces of evidence, or provides overall explanatory power. However, to be fair, this quick explanation doesn't go in depth into defending these points, and it is not Ehrman's biggest objection to the resurrection. But this should be a lesson to skeptics who try to use this short clip to debunk the resurrection. It is not thorough and doesn't meet the evidence. A more detailed theory can be seen in what Gerd Ludemann gives in his book The Resurrection of Christ. Ludemann argues along the same lines as Ehrman, but gives us more details. Ludemann believes Peter suffered a terrible amount of grief and sorrow after the death of Christ, and was the first to hallucinate an appearance of Jesus. Through the power of suggestion, Peter was able to lead the remaining grief-stricken disciples into experiencing their own hallucinations with Peter. They then led a group of 500 in mass ecstasy that resulted in many of them partaking in the experience. James and his brothers were caught up in this mass ecstasy going on in Jerusalem. Later on, Paul was becoming disenchanted with the beliefs about God of Second Temple Judaism, and secretly became attracted to the loving God of Christianity. According to Ludemann, Paul was suffering a mental war within himself. He wrestled against his subconscious but all-consuming needs for acceptance and self-importance, and projected these onto Christians, so as to justify attacking them all the most savagely. On his way to Damascus, Paul fled from his painful internal war into the safety of hallucinations. He came out believing God had called him to minister to the Gentiles as a Christian. However, because of his Jewish beliefs in final resurrection, he had to agree with the rest of the disciples. Their visions meant Jesus was physically resurrected. Later Christians to support the physical resurrection made up the empty tomb story. Narratives were constructed to combat Christians claiming Jesus was only symbolically resurrected, which became known to us as the Gospels. And according to Ludemann, this is how Christianity began. But already looking at this, we can see several problems that we have already addressed. First being that the empty tomb is a later myth that was added on. There is so much evidence for the tomb being empty, it is hard to dismiss, and we've already beat this enough. Ludemann surprisingly also thinks the discovery of the tomb by women was a later embellishment. But why? Such a fact was utterly embarrassing, and there was no reason to make it up. Ludemann accepts elsewhere certain facts were not made up because of how embarrassing they were, like how Peter denied Jesus 3 times, or the early skepticism of James. If he can accept the gospel writers would not make up facts that were embarrassing or dishonorable, why would that not be the case here? So I don't see how the empty tomb could be a later invention, considering the evidence and embarrassment factor. Another issue is Ludemann is trying to psychoanalyze Paul. This is even hard to do by psychologists who have a subject in front of them. As Martin Hengel says, Ludemann does not recognize these limits on the historian. Here he gets into the realm of psychological explanations, for which no verification is really possible. Moreover, the sources are far too limited for such psychologizing analyses. There just isn't enough information to know if Paul was troubled by guilt before his conversion. All we have are letters from after his conversion, and there is no indication he was suffering from guilt and sin and projecting negative emotions onto Christians. On the contrary, we have more evidence Paul and Pharisees like him did not experience such struggles in standing against Christians. Swedish scholar Christer Stendahl says, "Contrast Paul, a very happy and successful Jew, one who can, even when he thinks about it from his Christian perspective, say in his epistle to the Philippians, 'As to the righteousness under the law, I was blameless.' That is what he says. He experiences no troubles, no problems, no qualms of conscience, no feelings of shortcomings. He is a star pupil, the student to get the $1,000 graduate scholarship in Gamaliel's seminary. Nowhere in Paul's writings is there any indication that he had any difficulties in fulfilling what he, as a Jew, understood to be the requirements of the law." And Gary Habermas and Mike Licona point out from what we know about Paul, he does not fit the profile of one who is likely to experience a conversion psychosis, as according to Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So there is no reason Paul would be a likely candidate to suffer some type of internal delusion. No evidence is given anywhere that he was in a troubled condition, and he doesn't fit the profile. And even if by some chance that he did, there is no reason it would cause a sudden conversion. This view about Paul is entirely ad hoc, implausible, lacks explanatory power, and is simply made out of thin air. The same can be said about James. As we said in the second video of this series, there is no reason the shameful execution and death of Jesus would suddenly convince his skeptical brother to proclaim him as Lord, let alone get caught up in some group ecstasy of just 500. It is more likely the death of Jesus would only continue his unbelief. Ludemann also says the belief in physical resurrection stemmed from the disciples and Paul experiencing the hallucinations of Christ in the context of their culture. They thrust bodily resurrection onto their visions because that is the only way Jews could understand such appearances. But this is untenable for what the New Testament reports. The Christians claim to have visions of other people who had died, and never once claimed they were physically resurrected. Christians in Acts told the servant girl that she had just seen an angel of Peter when she reported to see Peter at the gate. So they understood what visions were. So this shows they did not need to thrust bodily resurrection onto what happened to Jesus. They could have just interpreted it in the exact same way. In fact, no one from that time period would thrust bodily resurrection onto a vision because the Jews did not expect such a thing to happen until the end of time. Only the Christians said this only happened to Jesus, which actually doesn't fit the culture. But Ludemann also has to admit bodily resurrection was the earliest belief of Christians, so his theory cannot explain the origins of the resurrection belief. Because of this, the assumption the disciples were in a condition to hallucinate a physical resurrection is lacking. Even if Peter was grief-stricken and convinced the others to partake in his hallucination, there would be little reason to think all would hallucinate and experience the same thing, let alone infer a physical resurrection. Group hallucinations are exceptionally rare and are supposed to vary in what is reported, and we already dealt with the psychology before and demonstrated the appearances do not match the conditions of what would be required for group hallucinations. So the same conditions apply as before. As Dale Allison says, one person can hallucinate, but 12 at the same time, and dozens over an extended period of time? These are legitimate questions, and waving a magic wand of mass hysteria will not make them vanish. So, as we've already explained, hallucinations cannot explain these appearances without lacking plausibility. I will also point out the same conditions of the hallucination theory apply for Ludemann's theory for the rest of these facts, since his basic argument regarding the appearances would be they were caused by hallucinations and mass hysteria. So we can apply the same logic we already went over, and I'll refer people to that previous video for more on that. But since that is the case, skeptical theories like this that blend different possibilities fail offering a satisfying explanation of the facts. If the basic theories themselves cannot explain the evidence, mixing them will not do much better. Perhaps the real problem is Ludemann and other skeptics who attempt this are always implying that if they can propose a naturalistic theory with an ounce of plausibility, it automatically trumps the resurrection theory. But presupposing naturalism is probably true doesn't show your proposal makes fewer assumptions, or can explain the data without being ad hoc or implausible. One should remember methodological neutrality, and not let their historical horizon force them to take a theory that is more ad hoc just because it conforms to their preconceived worldview. A little more is needed. Of course, there are plenty of other theories proposed by skeptical scholars, but they all fail for similar problems. Scholar Mike Licona deals with several in his book The Resurrection of Jesus, but none of them can really offer a satisfying theory to explain such radical changes. Some events would need to happen which could give the disciples a new perspective. Very few theories come close, and only one can satisfy all the data. It's time to cut to the chase and deal with the biggest objection to the resurrection of Jesus. and it is simply that miracles probably don't happen, so why should we accept a miracle occurred in this instance? Miracles are by far the most improbable explanation, so no matter how many problems the naturalistic theories have, the resurrection will always be the most improbable. If you have seen any debates with Bart Ehrman, this is his biggest objection to the resurrection, as he explains.
What are miracles? Miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. You might think they are impossible. If you do think so, then you're going to agree with my argument even more than I'm going to agree with my argument. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. They violate the way nature naturally works. They are so highly improbable, their probability is infinitesimally remote, that we call them miracles. No one on the face of this earth can walk on lukewarm water. What are the chances that one of us can do it? Well, none of us can. So let's say the chances are 1 in 10 billion. Well, suppose somebody can. Well, then it's a chance of 1 in 10 billion. But in fact, none of us can. What about the resurrection of Jesus? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it would be a miracle. The resurrection claims are claims that not only did Jesus' body come back to life, it came back to life never to die again. That's a violation of what naturally happens. Every day, time after time, millions of times a year. What are the chances of it happening? Well, it'd be a miracle. In other words, it'd be so highly improbable that we can't account for it by natural means. A theologian may claim that it's true. And to argue with the theologian, we'd have to argue on theological grounds, because there are no historical grounds to argue on. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, the miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim historically that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't.
So Ehrman's biggest problem with the resurrection is it is a miracle, and by definition, the least probable thing that could happen. Therefore, we must dismiss the resurrection a priori, and it cannot be a competing theory. This is similar to Hume's argument that miracles are impossible. It basically is the same argument, except for saying that miracles are impossible, he says that miracles are improbable. Therefore, because of this, the same logic will apply, and the same problems result. As Hume said that the uniform testimony of history shows that natural laws cannot be violated, and therefore miracles are impossible, Ehrman is basically just saying that since billions of people have not been raised from the dead, they have established it probably cannot happen. Therefore, Jesus' resurrection is improbable as well. But like Hume, this is just arguing in a circle, because he has just said that the experience against them shows them to be improbable, and we can only know a resurrection is the least probable explanation if we know that they probably do not occur. So we are again, like Hume, arguing in a circle. So just switch out impossible for improbable, and Ehrman's reasoning follows the same erroneous logic Hume attempted. But we should also ask, why must a miracle be the least probable by default in all circumstances? Why do we have to presuppose this and evaluate claims with this to restrict us, and tell us how to think as we evaluate the evidence for something? What if the evidence favors the theory of resurrection has happened? Why do we have to presuppose naturalism is already probably true, and that a resurrection cannot happen? Is that really being open to the evidence and accepting the most rational conclusion? Or is it dismissing the resurrection theory because it doesn't cohere with our already determined worldview? Should we not be open to the evidence instead of trying to make it fit our already determined beliefs? Ehrman's argument is the resurrection should be dismissed outright as improbable, regardless of the evidence, because they probably don't happen. But he can only conclude this if he discounts evidence which favors a resurrection happen. It actually doesn't address the evidence. It is arguing as if his conclusion, a resurrection did not happen, is already true. But Ehrman only concludes this because resurrections have not happened on a rapid scale. Therefore, it probably didn't happen this time. This does nothing to actually evaluate the specific evidence for this event, but instead, a priori excludes any theory, however likely it is, that disagrees with your preconceived notions about how reality should work. In actuality, each claim should be judged on a case-by-case basis, and we should look at the evidence specific for that claim, not dismiss one possibility because we a priori assume it probably cannot happen. These sweeping dismissals, whether from Hume or Ehrman, are nothing more than circular reasoning and dismissing any type of evidence that challenges their already determined worldview. As Mike Laconis says, historians should approach the data neither presupposing nor a priori excluding the possibility of God acting and raising Jesus. They should instead form and weigh hypotheses for the best explanation. Probability ought to be determined in this manner rather than by forming a definition of miracle that excludes the serious consideration of a hypothesis prior to the examination of the data. Unlike Ehrman, some do not come right out and say this, but instead will look at the evidence for the resurrection, but still judge their final conclusion, while including the prior probability and background knowledge of people rising from the dead, and say the prior probability of a resurrection happening is so low, since they don't happen regularly, that no amount of evidence can overcome that. This essentially suffers from the same circular conclusions we just went over. But if this was true, that the prior probability plays such a high role in determining how likely an event is, then we should conclude that any event in history that occurred just once never has enough evidence to back a warranted belief it happened. Why? Because if an event occurs only once, it has a low prior probability of it taking place, and therefore every event that happened just once probably did not happen, regardless of how much evidence we currently have for it actually happening. For example, take the event of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. Such an event did not happen prior, and it hasn't happened since. We don't know how Hannibal was able to do this, or even which path he took. It is actually quite miraculous that he was even able to do it without modern technology. But does the fact that no one ever completed it prior mean it did not happen with Hannibal? Of course not, and we have sufficient historical evidence that it did occur, which is even less evidence than the resurrection has, since with Hannibal, all we have is much later Roman sources. The fact that an event only happened once doesn't create a serious background knowledge problem for the actual evidence given for a single unique event, if the evidence is sufficient to account for it. In other words, background knowledge cannot be used automatically to say the evidence can never be adequate. I've argued the evidence for the resurrection can overcome the background knowledge, and there is no reason to think it cannot. Why would the background knowledge be too powerful to overcome? I see no reason why it is. Second, the background knowledge is not simply the amount of resurrections that have happened, but should also include if God exists and is able to perform miracles. If these things are true, the background knowledge for the resurrection is not as low as some have suggested. So moving on, we also need to note Ehrman's claim is also self-defeating, because he says the resurrection is a theological claim, not a historical claim. So the historian cannot say whether the resurrection is probable or not, because it is outside the scope of what the historian can say. If this is the case, he has only refuted his own argument, because now he cannot say the resurrection is improbable, because that is making a claim about the probability of the resurrection. So why is he claiming the resurrection is the least probable, when by his own words, that claim of probability cannot be made by the historian? Thus Ehrman refutes his own claim the resurrection is improbable. We can also ask why Ehrman presupposes historians cannot evaluate miracle claims. Where is this rule set in stone that historians are excluded from evaluating certain claims in history just because it might infer the existence of something beyond the natural? Ehrman makes this claim often, like it is set in stone, but never backs it up, and for good reason, because not all historians agree with Ehrman on this. David Hackett Fisher says, specific canons of historical proof are neither widely observed nor generally agreed upon. Thomas Haskell says that history, unlike English and philosophy, lacks even the possibility of defining a single canon familiar to all practitioners. Many historians, secular and Christian, feel evaluating miracle claims is perfectly acceptable, whereas others disagree. So why is Ehrman just deciding ad hoc the rules of history exclude the evaluation of miracles, when that has not been agreed upon or proven to be the case? There is no a priori reason historians have to exclude the study of miracles. Finally, Ehrman likes to try one more thing. If we are willing to say Jesus rose from the dead, based on the evidence we have, we also have to conclude other miracles in other religions have happened as well, based on the same testimony of witnesses. This is an attempt at a reductio ad absurdum, by saying if the resurrection is true, then other miracle claims also have to be true. However, this fails for several reasons. First, Christians are not outright going to reject reports of other miracles, even from other religions. Remember, we believe there are other powers at work, some good and some evil. So if other miraculous events happen, they will cohere just fine with our worldview. It is not going to create the turmoil Ehrman and other atheists who use this argument think it will. All it will do is confirm our belief there are spiritual powers at work. Second, even though there are good reasons for holding to the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, that doesn't somehow transfer credibility to other supposed miracle workers in other religions. Miracle claims are judged on a case-by-case basis, based on what evidence each claim has specific to it. Just because we grant one miracle happen, that doesn't open the floodgate. In the same way, just because some people from the Middle East are Muslims, that doesn't mean they all are. Third, many of these other miracle claims do not have nearly the amount of evidence the resurrection has, as Anthony Flew even admitted. Nothing comes close, and many of these supposed miracles have been addressed. Tim McGrew addresses several miracles Hume tried to bring up, and Mike Licona knocks down several of Ehrman's biggest examples. So many of these additional miracles can be found to be lacking in evidence, and even have contrary evidence to counteract them. Fourth and most importantly, any skeptic who tries to refute the resurrection with a reductio ad absurdum only ends up shooting themselves in the foot, because they are essentially arguing miracles can and have happened, and thus are defeating naturalism for us. If an atheist tries to argue other miracles have happened in an attempt to parody the resurrection theory, they are only going to shoot themselves in the foot and essentially agree with Christians that miracles are not only possible, but there is good evidence that they have occurred. It does nothing to make naturalistic theories look like the best explanation of the facts. Nor do these supposed parodies actually overturn the resurrection theory, because they focus on some completely other event that is still not going to show God doesn't exist and that he could not have raised Jesus from the dead. It is only going to strengthen the idea there are heavenly powers at work and can perform miracles. So if some atheists think there are good arguments for other miracles, be my guest and bring them up. It is not going to help them in arguing for a naturalistic worldview. So to conclude, Ehrman's argument is nothing more than a semantic twist on the same argument Hume employed. It is circular, it does nothing to actually address the evidence for the resurrection. He should do what other skeptical historians do, which is offer a more rigorous theory for which he thinks best explains the evidence. But as we have seen, no theory can explain the evidence with the explanatory scope and power of the resurrection theory. Unless one argues from a biased position and clings to a naturalist or non-Christian worldview, there is no reason to dismiss the resurrection outright. It best explains the data, and no other theory comes close. What if we have it all wrong? What if the disciples never taught Jesus was physically resurrected, but that he was only spiritually vindicated by God, and all the disciples experienced were internal visions? This is an argument presented by some skeptical scholars who deny the evidence physical resurrection was the original belief of the disciples, and instead, they claim this was only interpreted by later Christians. Despite the evidence we already gave showing this cannot be the case, they actually try the argument that the earliest Christian records, given to us by Paul, actually teach Jesus was only spiritually vindicated in heaven and not bodily raised, and therefore the disciples and Paul never taught a bodily resurrection of Jesus. Here's how the argument goes. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, the appearance he received is exactly how Jesus appeared to the other disciples. And according to Acts, this was nothing more than a spiritual vision of light that only Paul himself could understand. Thus, since Paul says all the appearances were the same, then this is how all the other disciples experienced Jesus, according to our earliest source of Paul. The physical resurrection appearances were only made up later, and the real appearances the disciples had were just internal visions. Thus, Paul admits the disciples only had subjective visions and never experienced the risen Jesus. Well, to be fair, this is a well thought out theory, but the first time I heard it, I have to admit that I actually laughed a little. Because if you think about it for just a second, you'll realize there are several problems with it. First, even if the appearance Paul received was just an internal vision, this doesn't necessitate the other appearances to the apostles were internal visions as well. Paul never actually says all the appearances were the same. The creed Paul cites is not about what each person saw, but it is a list of who saw. This in no way implies each appearance was the same, as William Lane Craig says. In including himself in the list, Paul in no sense implies that the foregoing appearances were the same sort of appearances as the one to him. He is concerned here not with the how of the appearances, but with who appeared. Just because Paul lists appearances, that does not mean all the appearances happen in the same way. Just like if I talk to your mother over the phone and later list people who have spoken to her and include you who have actually spoken with her in person, that would not mean we both have only spoken with her over the phone. A list of witnesses does not tell us how each of those witnesses experienced an event. They could have been different. Some could have been longer, some could have been more detailed, some with more physical interaction. A list of appearances does not mean all the appearances happen the same way. So this is just a conjecture made by skeptics. Second, skeptics are trying to tell us they are getting back to the earliest Christian beliefs by only looking at early sources. But they are relying heavily on Acts, which was not written by Paul, and many of these skeptics say it is very late and unreliable. Some even place it well into the 2nd century. And I've never seen a proponent of this theory say Acts was written before 85 AD, meaning by skeptical standards, it is not an early account of Paul's conversion. So if we go by their own standards, we cannot say it details Paul's conversion as according to Paul himself, or by another early source. In reality, if we go by early sources, all we really have is Paul saying Jesus appeared to him, which doesn't teach that Jesus actually only was an internal vision Paul had. But some skeptics believe Acts has preserved an early account of Paul's conversion that was later compiled into Acts, and they believe this because, according to them, it doesn't teach Jesus was physically resurrected, which they know was the earliest belief of Christians. And they know this because Paul didn't teach Jesus was physically resurrected. But they don't get this from Paul's letters, but from these select parts of Acts. So this is nothing more than circular reasoning. If skeptics really thought Luke was late, they should not be interpreting 1 Corinthians 15 through Acts 9. But because they think it fits their theory, of course they'll include it and discount the rest of Luke and Acts. It is just picking and choosing what you need to support your preconceived notion. If the account of Paul's conversion in Acts is early, then why are not the other accounts of Jesus' appearance as early as well? They are written the same way, by the same author, and many of the speeches which teach physical resurrection in Acts seem to be early due to their Aramaic structure. Why are skeptics just picking the parts they want to be early, then dismissing the rest as late? If Luke and Acts have reliable parts and can be used for studying the first Christians, then why are all the parts which teach a very obvious physical resurrection not reliable? The only reason seems to be given is that physical resurrection was not taught at first, so it had to be later, and this is just circular reasoning. Third, if we look at the actual descriptions of what Paul experienced in Acts, it doesn't really imply Paul just experienced an internal vision. Of all three accounts, they all agree Paul's companions experienced something as well. In Acts 9, they heard something. In Acts 22, it says they saw a light, but couldn't make out the voice. In Acts 26, it says they fell to the ground. Despite the possible contradictions, they all agree that people with Paul experienced something. Acts also says Paul was blinded for 3 days afterwards, suggesting the event recorded in Acts is not an internal vision, but an external appearance that caused a physical blindness. So it doesn't even seem that Acts teaches Paul experienced an internal vision, but an external appearance in a literal blinding light. But why doesn't Luke just record Paul's experience like how the other apostles experienced Jesus? Well, that is just presupposing Luke was just making it all up as he pleased. But also, it would not fit with the narrative Luke gives us. Of course Jesus should appear to Paul in a blinding light from heaven. Remember, first Jesus was resurrected, and he appeared to the disciples. Then he ascended into heaven, where he remained until he appeared to Paul in a heavenly light. This doesn't contradict the other appearances. It coheres with the previous appearances in conjunction with the chronology of where Christ would have been. And again, the wording in Acts doesn't teach Paul's experience was just an internal vision. Fourth, what does Paul, our earliest source, actually say about this event? In his own words, not Luke's, he says Jesus appeared to him. If we're going on the early sources, why are we appealing to Acts and not looking at what Paul said himself? If you look at the text of 1 Corinthians 15, it is very clear Paul taught a physical resurrection of Jesus. As we've already pointed out, the creed he cites says that Jesus was buried and raised. It is pretty obvious that what was buried is what was raised. Otherwise, why even mention the burial part and just go from death to ascension? But looking at the context, verse 12 through 34 talks about the resurrection of the dead specifically, and Paul directly says, "For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead." And this Greek word for resurrection directly means a bodily event of coming back to life, not a transition to a spiritual existence. There was never a time this word was used to mean a transition to a spiritual disembodied existence. From verse 34 to 41, Paul directly mentions several times it's about the type of body that will be raised. In this verse directly says how the resurrection of the dead is about how our bodies are perishable, but will be raised to be imperishable. But skeptics move past this and instead focus on verse 44 to 50, where Paul says, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable." Skeptics try to assert here that Paul is teaching that the resurrection only means we are spiritually raised, not physically resurrected. This is because Paul says we shall receive a spiritual body, and that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. So clearly we are not bodily raised, but only in a spiritual sense. Well, first off, this ignores the immediate context of what Paul says prior to this, and as well as what he says right after this. "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, Then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So it is clear Paul is still teaching our bodies will be physically resurrected and changed, and death will be defeated, not our saving grace as we transition to a spiritual existence. So why would he teach a completely different doctrine right in the middle of this passage? Well, we have to look at what these words and phrases mean. Let's not force our cultural understanding of these words onto a completely different culture. What does Paul mean by these words? Paul uses this word for natural only one other time outside of this passage, and it is not used to contrast physical beings and spiritual beings, but rather he is contrasting those who live by their sinful desires and those who live with heavenly desires. Richard Hayes says about this word, the term psychic is difficult to translate properly. It refers to human beings living in their natural state apart from the Spirit of God, and therefore unenlightened and blind to the truth. They don't get it. Mike Licona documents 846 occurrences of this word from between the 8th century BC and the 3rd century AD, and has yet to find one instance of where the word means physical or material. It is simply not a word that is meant to mean material body, but is meant to mean an unenlightened person. So why would it mean that in 1 Corinthians 15? However, the word it is contrasted with, that is translated as spiritual, does at times mean immaterial, but unlike this previous word, it has a variety of meanings. Many times it is employed to mean something like enlightened. Paul uses the word outside of 1 Corinthians 15 over a dozen times, and it only means immaterial once. Mostly, he uses it to mean spiritually mature, spiritual wisdom, spiritual gifts, spiritual blessings, and others as well. Thus, given the context, and given the word natural means unenlightened, it is pretty obvious this verse is meant to contrast unenlightened with enlightened. As Mike Licona says, when employing the terms natural and spiritual, Paul is not referring to the substance of the old and new bodies, but rather their mode of existence. He is saying that our current body is buried with all of its natural or this worldly appetites and weaknesses, but is raised and transformed into a new body with spiritual appetites and qualities. So now that we know the meaning of these words, they can help us to understand the next few verses. The following verse cannot mean Jesus was always just some spirit, like in Gnosticism, since these words are rooted in the two previous words. The only difference is these words are substantive instead of adjectives. And second, no author ever used these words to contrast physical and immaterial, thus destroying the probability Paul is contrasting that here. But what about verse 50, where Paul says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God? Doesn't this show heaven is purely spiritual and not a physical resurrection? Again, we should ask what this phrase means to the people who wrote it, not what does it mean to us in our culture. A small minority of scholars believe this phrase flesh and blood actually means a physical body, whereas the overwhelming majority accept it as just a figure of speech to express frail human nature. As Licona says, it is sort of like today if we were to say you can't trust a cold-blooded man, or that person's blood is boiling, or that's a red-blooded American. It is not referring to their actual biological makeup, but a state of their mind or personality. The phrase also doesn't appear often in the New Testament. However, it is common in early Jewish and rabbinic literature, and the phrase always seems to mean mortality, not simply having a physical body. This is pretty obvious in the context, as N.T. Wright says. The second half of verse 50 already explains, in Hebraic parallelism with the first half, more or less what he means, as Paul's regular use of flesh would itself indicate flesh and blood, is a way of referring to ordinary corruptible decaying human existence. It does not simply mean, as it has so often been taken to mean, physical humanity in the normal modern sense, but the present physical humanity as opposed to the future one, which is subject to decay and death. Scholars also point out verse 53 is nothing more than a restatement of verse 50. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. The verse could not be more clear. Our present mortal bodies must be changed to be immortal. The surrounding context is undeniable. Our bodies will be transformed into new immortal ones, just like what happened to Christ, who is the first fruits of the resurrection. Most of 1 Corinthians 15 is pretty obvious, even by our own cultural understanding, that Paul is teaching our physical bodies will be resurrected and transformed. And once we understand the cultural context of these verses that stick out, we see they fit right into the rest of the passage. If we try to interpret the rest of this chapter by these few verses alone, not only will we ignore the cultural context, but will make unparsimonious interpretations in trying to explain the rest of the chapter. Thus it is clear, Paul never taught a spiritual resurrection. His own words confirm a belief that Jesus was physically resurrected and appeared to them, and Luke's words, even taken out of context, still do not teach a spiritual resurrection. This is why even Gerd Ludemann, who doesn't believe the disciples experienced a physical resurrection, accepts the earliest belief of the Christians was a physical resurrection. The evidence is simply undeniable, and you have to jump through some pretty crazy hoops to try to interpret Paul to be claiming he believed in a spiritual vision only. Therefore, we can be confident that when we read Jesus was raised from the dead, it actually happened, not because of blind faith or a feeling in our hearts, but because the evidence points us to it. Jesus was resurrected, has conquered sin and death, and sits at the right hand of the Father. He is not in the grave. He is alive.